We've covered our fair share of building collapses on this channel, and there are plenty more to go. The amount of incompetence and sleazy business practices will continue to expand as long as someone thinks they can get away with it. Today, we'll take a look at a building that should have never been, and the unbelievable people behind it who lacked any scrap of moral or responsibility. Let's take a look at what happened to cause the Palace 2 building collapse. Palace 2 was a high-rise tower block apartment building built in Barra da Tijuca, Brazil. It began construction in 1990 and finished up in 1995. The 22-story building rested on the beach, meant for middle to upper-class residences. The building was constructed by Sersan, a company backed by the at the time 55-year-old Sergio Naya, a civil engineer who designed and saw through the building process. This man would be the epicenter of this catastrophe, but let's talk about what happened first. On February 22, 1998, the Palace 2 began to startle residents with trembling that had some of them fleeing from the building. Just hours later, a section of the tower began to crumble and fall. The section killed 8 people who had run back inside to rescue some clothing. Even with these deaths, this collapse wasn't enough to condemn the building or even cause an evacuation, because days later, the engineers who had been responsible deemed the building safe. Now, I don't know if I would have listened to these people, but the residents felt like they had no choice and would take their chances with the building they called home. Unfortunately, their trust would be challenged again when on the 27th, just a few days after the first section collapsed, the rest of the building would crumble to the ground. All families living in the building were unable to retrieve any of their belongings and were sent to stay in hotels in their new homeless state. There had been 176 units and 130 families living in the building, now reduced to rubble. The investigations were underway to figure out what happened to cause this. These investigations would find some of the most shoddy, cheap shortcuts in the building's construction. Steel rods were corroded by sea salt because inside the pillars was sea sand and seashells. We've talked about buildings that had oil cans in the walls, but some of the columns of the Palace 2 were completely hollow. This building was doomed to collapse, and the people who constructed it had to know this. Building inspectors either overlooked these conditions, or most likely they were told to look the other way. Terrifyingly, the Sersan company had done this kind of dangerous, lackluster work on many different buildings that spanned as far as Orlando, Florida. Rio lawyer Ivan Muniz stated, "Having half a building fall is very uncommon, but there's a lot of cases of companies building these kinds of residential buildings. If I lived in Barra, I would be very afraid." Owner Naya was able to get away with all of this because he was a 3-term congressman in Brazil. While his company was facing over 800 lawsuits, they were all tied up in courts for years, allowing him to continue to make these dangerous builds while skirting the law over and over again. This wasn't the only case of law-breaking Naya was known for, as a Brazilian congressman is not supposed to be a majority partner in a business, but this guy seemed to believe he was above the law. A millionaire with a jet and a large plot of international real estate who bragged on video about falsifying the signature of the governor for a land deal, illegally importing hemodialysis equipment, and supplying poor quality materials for his building. He's a real piece of work. The laws in Brazil have stated as generally being good but not enforced. Elected officials like Naya can be rather untouchable when it comes to criminal prosecution, and the 55-year-old man was taking full advantage of this. National outcry asked for Naya to be fired from his position, but unfortunately, it did little to get him removed. In fact, Naya, quote, probably would be elected in the next elections. Bank loan agent Maria Teresa Abranches said, "The people have a short memory." Naya and his company, unfortunately, aren't the only issues Brazil had in the construction sector. While the building codes have been described as rather good, the enforcement of them were very lax. Keep in mind, all this information on this collapse is from 1998, so hopefully building inspections and enforcement has improved in Brazil since then, but let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and thanks for this suggestion from one of my subscribers. For more true crime and horror, please consider subscribing. Game with me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter, and as always, be well.